Hello, my name is Jeff Frensink. I am the wireless instructor at iPexpert, and in this video I'm going to be talking to you about the wireless racks at proctorlabs.com. Now, these are the racks that we typically use with all of our workbooks and classes and things like that, so we want to get you guys familiar with that if you aren't already so. So in this video we'll talk a little bit about what's in the racks, hardware, software versions, the topology that's already set up in the racks, getting access, what types of access you have to the devices in your racks, getting a session scheduled, and then actually working with the devices once you are in your session. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at things. So here is just the homepage at proctorlabs.com. First, if you want to just grab some information about the wireless racks, you can just scroll down and you see the different racks that we have. We'll click on the wireless V rack right by my head here. Give you a little bit of information, so some information to glean from within here if you want. You can see that we have a number of sessions. Sessions last, they're in every 4 hours, but you get 3 hours and 45 minutes of that, so assuming you book one session. So if you book session A, it would be from midnight to 3:45, and this is Eastern Standard Time is the reference time for this. But if you schedule multiple time slots in a row, then you get all the time, connecting. So let's say you scheduled two sessions, session A and session B here. So you would get essentially 7 hours and 45 minutes. So you get the full 4 hours of the first session, and then it would blend right into your second session of 3 hours and 45 minutes. It would be the same rack for both. You wouldn't get kicked off at the end of session A and have to re-log into session B or anything like that. It would just be one long continuous session. And same thing if you did 3 in a row. Then you would have, 11 hours and 45 minutes. So the first session full 4 hours, session 2 the first full 4 hours, and then the last session is 3 hour 45. Same rack the entire time, never getting kicked off or anything like that. So one long extended session. So you absolutely can do that if you want to get longer periods of time on the racks. The topology. So let's talk about what's actually in our racks. You can click on the view topology here if you want to see the picture. There's also a description on the site. But basically we have a good representation of what you would actually see in the lab. So from a controller standpoint, we have two 5508 controllers and two 2504 controllers running 70116, so the 70MR1 code that you'll see in the lab. From a switching perspective, we have 3560s across the board. You will see that model in the lab. Now, other models in the lab would be a 2960, which is essentially a 3560 that's only layer 2. So pretty much the same thing. And then 6500s, we didn't go nuts and buy 6500s because honestly there's very little difference in terms of the 6500s and 3560s for what we care about in the wireless lab. Now there's plenty of differences, but not that really shine through, so it wasn't worth spending the extra lots and lots of money for 6500s just to run you through just a couple teeny little scenarios. So 3560s across the board, we have 4 of them. And they are running a 12252 or 53 SE code, so a similar lab code to what you would see in the lab. From an access point perspective, we have 2 access points that are designated as autonomous APs, so that's what they're loaded up with, autonomous code. One's a 1262, one's a 1242. In the lab we don't have 1242s, but honestly there's little difference between the lab APs and lower mall APs. So again, we're saving costs of the lab equipment, making it cheaper for you, but still giving you lab models for you to practice on, even though not every AP in our racks are the same models. You will at least get one of each that you'll see in the lab, which is the 1040s, 1260s, and 3500s. We have at least one of each of these in our racks. So 2 autonomous APs. We also have 5 lightweight APs. We have a 3500, 2 1242s, a 1262, and a 1042. So again, a good smattering, definitely at least one of every type of AP that you'll run into in the lab we have in our racks. And obviously the lightweight APs are running the same code as in the controllers. The autonomous APs are running the lab code of 12425 DJA. So that's pretty much all the hardware that you're going to have access to. Now there is reference of a CME router, kind of in the top left there. The router is in fact there. You don't have access to it. Just like in the real lab, you have no access to any routers. So while there may be routers in the topology, you don't have access to it. Servers. We have 4 different servers or PCs running in the lab. They're all running on the ESX box. They're on a single port of the switch on the top right there. But we have ACS 5.2, just like we have in the lab. No service patches, or patches I should say, applied to that, so just the base 5.2 code. We have WCS running the 70MR1 code, which I believe is 70172. We have an MSE, again 70MR1 code, which I think is 70201 code. And then we have a test PC, which is a Windows 7 PC. That's what you'll use to actually connect up to all of the SSIDs and WLANs that you'll be configuring across your devices. So all 4 of those housed within an ESX server. So you'll have access to those as well. From a topology standpoint here, you see we have kind of 3 major sections. On the top, the big section is the headquarters section. So this is where we have 3 of our 4 switches. We have 3 of our 4 controllers in here, and the bulk of our APs, both the autonomous APs are in there. And the bottom right, we have a medium office section. Sometimes it's referred to as a remote office section, just depending on where you're looking. 1 controller and 2 APs, single switch in there. And then we have this home office section, the bottom left. Sometimes that is included in whatever the scenario we're giving you. Sometimes it's not. So you'll see LAP3 is in the home office, and you'll also see LAP3 in the HQ. It is one and the same AP. They're both plugged into the same switch, same port. It's just sometimes that AP is referenced as home office, sometimes it's not. So that's where you get that. There is a phone in each rack. You can see the phone listed in the home office there. I mean, it can connect to anything anywhere because this is all in the same room. But that phone is pre-configured to connect up to a couple of SSIDs. You don't have any access to it. We don't really have that technology at the moment, but it is there, so it can connect up to some stuff under certain lab scenarios. And that test PC is actually just the test PC up in the HQ there running in the ESX server. So that would be the topology. Those are the software versions that we're talking about. So I'll go ahead and close this out here real quick. So getting access to your devices, let's talk about the different ways that we can actually access your devices. So this was a little bit of the topology here. But we really have 2 ways of accessing our devices. We can either directly access them. In other words, on your computer, you pull up a web browser and type in the IP address of a wireless LAN controller to pull up the GUI wireless LAN controller. So you're directly talking to the wireless LAN controller via TCP/IP. Or we can get to the term server, so console connections. So those 2 different methods, we have a couple different ways of getting to, well, I guess we have separate ways of getting to those. So you can kind of see this topology here where we have you sitting somewhere on the internet. Now we basically have 2 devices accessible directly from the internet. One of them is a term server. So the term server, if you've never used a term server, is a way to get console connectivity remotely. So the term server has a bunch of connections to the console ports of all the different devices. So we have console connectivity to every controller, every switch, and every access point. So you'll always have console port access to all of those devices. So the term server has a physical connection to each one of these console ports, and then it has an Ethernet connection. And so what happens is you telnet to the term server, and then the term server allows the telnet session to pass through it and then drop you off on one of the console sessions. So it's a way for you to get remote console access. That's available directly on the internet, so you can hit that at any time without doing anything special. Now, direct access to the devices requires layer 3 connectivity between your PC and the device you're trying to connect to. So in order to get that, we need to get VPN in. So that's the other way that we have of access. So you can also VPN, it's a Cisco IPsec VPN connection to our VPN device that's out on the internet. The VPN device will then read your credentials, look in the database, and then drop you off into the appropriate rack. Now, if you kind of go back to our topology, really the VPN connection just drops you off to the CME. And then the CME has a connection to the VPN side. It also has a connection into your rack. And so you could actually, if I can do it not behind my head here, get direct access into everything in the rack as long as you're VPN'd in. So those are the two ways we have to connect to things. You'll be doing both quite a bit. A lot of the stuff that we do oftentimes is GUI based, WCS, lock controller GUI type stuff, ACS, things like that. So we'll be spending a fair amount of time with VPN connections as well as console ports for switches, CLI configs of APs and controllers and all that type of stuff too. So just know that if you need to get to a console port, it's through the term server. If you need to directly target an IP address, whether it's a web GUI, RDP session, SSH, that's through the VPN connection. Now, speaking of that VPN connection, it's important to note, don't just assume because you have VPN connection that you can immediately pull up every web GUI and every RDP session and things like that. That's not necessarily the case. Why is that? Well, in order to pull up a web GUI or something like that, you need end-to-end layer 3 communications. Getting a VPN connection only gets you to the CME router. To get beyond the CME router to, in this case, let's say we were trying to pull up the GUI of the WCS server, we need to have the switches configured such that all the port to the CME is configured correctly, the switch-to-switch links are configured correctly, the switch-to-server link is configured correctly, we have default gateways configured, we have routing configured. The full end-to-end path between you and the server needs to be configured correctly, otherwise you're not going to be able to pull up that GUI. So in the default state of our racks, the racks get reverted to sort of a fresh state. And the fresh state has very, very minimal configurations in it so that you can go ahead and configure whatever it is that you want to configure without having to remove a whole bunch of junk that you didn't want there. So all your switches at the default state, no VLANs, no layer 3 interfaces. So if you just got a fresh session that you haven't preloaded any configs onto, you probably won't be able to get to any of the GUIs. You'll have to get those switches set up. So if you ever have problems hitting a GUI, usually what I recommend for just a really quick test, if you ping 10.10.205.20, this is the CME router. It's a loopback on the CME router, so it's always available. If that works, VPN's up. If you can't get to the desired device, then it's somewhere between the CME router and whatever it is you're trying to talk to. So just remember that when it comes time to, when you're VPN'd in but you still can't get to something, it's almost always an issue with your network connection somewhere between the CME and the device that you're trying to access. But console, always there, always working because it doesn't require anything other than just an internet connection on your part. Okay, so let's talk then about getting our sessions scheduled and getting up and running actually on the rack. So if I head back to the home page here, everyone is going to have their own account, so you'll go ahead and get logged in here. So we have the client login, just put your username and password in there, submit to get logged in, and you'll get dropped off in your members area, no thank you. So depending on what you have scheduled or purchased, you'll have different options under here. So for instance, I have an active session right now, so I get this go to current VRAC session. But if you don't have a currently scheduled session that's active, you won't see this button. You would see, potentially view or cancel future sessions. If you've scheduled a future session but it's not yet time, you'll get this. But if you haven't scheduled any future sessions, you won't even get this button. So these buttons are dynamic based off of what you've done. But if you want to schedule now, you'll have the schedule now your vouchers. When you purchase the sessions, you'll get the vouchers for it. So list all your vouchers here. You can schedule now. You can go ahead and just pick whatever date that you want to schedule in on. Probably want to pick a date where I'm not teaching. You'll see the available sessions. Just click your session. You can add to cart and complete there, and you'll get the session scheduled. Once the session is scheduled, one thing that you might want to consider is defining what the initial config should be. Now, if you don't say anything, it'll just be sort of a generic config, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But if you go to view or cancel future sessions, you'll get this link that says select lab configurations for future sessions right up here, sorry. If you click in on that, it's going to list your sessions, and then you can say, okay, well, when this session hits, what config do I want loaded? So this is an easy way to just sort of get this fired off before you're even on your session. It allows the time for servers to boot and load up services and things like that. So it'll make things a little bit more efficient. So look to that as a little bit of a time-saving method. But you can just go ahead and choose whichever lab load you want, and then you can see that we've selected this particular lab load. So once the session starts, it should fire off and load that. Once your session actually, the time has come for your session, you get this Go to Current VRAC Session button. We'll click here. You get a little EULA that you're supposed to agree to. Fine, hit I agree. Then the next place you're going to be sent to is some help for VPN setup. So if you've already set up VPN, you can just go ahead and click right on Continue Session. But if not, you have this option to show VPN instructions. So depending on what type of device you're using, you'll access the VPN in a few different ways. And this gives you all the information that you need to know. For instance, if you're using a Windows PC, you need the old school Cisco VPN client. If you're using a Mac, you can just use the built-in IPsec VPN functionality of your Mac. If you're using something else, Linux, there's instructions for pretty much everything here. So it'll get you up and running in terms of VPN. I won't go into the details of everything because that's what these instructions are for. It would take a little bit too long. But once you have your VPN figured out, you'll go ahead and you'll continue the session. And this is really where you land. So from within here is where we have our ability to control our rack details here. So we have 4 different tabs going along the top here. We'll just start off left to right and kind of talk about what each one is. So the first tab we have is Load Lab. This is what's going to allow you to pre-configure or load the configuration of the devices for whatever workbook or scenario you're planning on going through. So we have a few to talk about. Before we talk about that, let's just quickly tell you what the default state of the rack would be had you not done any initial lab loads. On the switches, there's pretty much a host name, and that's about it. No VLANs, no layer 3 interfaces, physical interfaces aren't configured, so pretty much nothing, which means no routing and switching is really going to work right off the bat. Autonomous APs, we have a host name, a static IP address on the BVI, and that's about it. Lightweight APs should just be at a default state. Wireless LAN controllers will have run through the initial setup script, so you won't have to do that, which means that it'll have a host name, it'll have the management interface configured, and some basic stuff like mobility domain group, but very little outside of that. So no WLANs, no dynamic interfaces, things like that. And that should be it. Servers will just be at a fairly generic state, so ACS will be there. You can log into it, but nothing's pre-configured. Same thing, WCS will be at a default state of configuration, same with the MSC. So nothing really pre-configured other than just the initial get this application up and working type stuff. So if you need something besides that, that's where the lab loads come in. So let's talk about each of these categories here. So basic connectivity. So let's say that you just wanted to play around with stuff, but you didn't want to have to take the time to load up all the initial config of the switches. You didn't want to have to create your own VLANs and configure the interfaces and layer 3 and routing and that type of stuff. If you want to skip that, that's what this is for. So you could do the basic connectivity. Now there's 2 lobes under here. There's either basic, which just gives you the general routing and switching and port configurations. So you don't have to do that, which means GUIs will be accessible right off the bat, things like that. But no DHCP scopes will be there. Your APs won't be joined, so you would still have to do that type of stuff. If you want to skip ahead a little bit further, you can do the basic connectivity with DHCP and AP joins, and now your lightweight APs will be pulling IP addresses. They should be discovering controllers, and at that point, you can pretty much start configuring WLANs and all the stuff beyond that. So we get you a little bit further ahead there. So some time-saving stuff if you don't want to do, per se a workbook example. You don't want to run through a workbook scenario, but you don't want to waste your time, just configuring wired stuff over and over again. So and then we have lab loads for our workbooks. So we have Volume 1, Volume 2. With Volume 1, just choose whichever lab you want to go to. Let's say you want to go volume 1, lab 1. You would just hit the initial for this. And it's going to say, okay, well, which devices do you want to pre-configure? By default, it'll do all of them. Usually that's what you want. You hit yes. Every device will get their initial configuration. You can also do just individuals. Let's say I only wanted to configure the controllers. Just uncheck everything else. And now only the controllers will receive the configuration. Sometimes this is helpful if we're going through a scenario and then you're like, okay, well, let me just let me start these devices over from the beginning, and I'll just redo these devices rather than every other device. Sometimes that's another reason why you would only do some devices as opposed to all the others. But that's how you would do that. We have our Volume 2 workbook, so our 5 labs under Volume 2. And then if you've taken a class from me, the boot camp or the 1-week lab experience, we also have the lab loads for those as well. All right. The lab loads do take a little bit of time though. It takes time to wipe the config, reboot the devices, apply the brand new config on things like servers. We use snapshots in ESX, but it takes time for the revert to complete, power the servers on, wait for the servers to boot, wait for the applications to start up after the server's booted. So it can take a little bit of time, and you have to have a little patience, especially on the server side where they're not necessarily the snappiest servers all the time. So you might have to have a little patience for those. Usually the network devices come up first, and then the servers come up a little bit later. At least they complete their boot a little bit later. Okay, on the controls tab. So we have a few things that we can do underneath here. So you see for all our different devices, so we have 4 switches, 4 wireless LAN controllers, our lightweight APs, autonomous APs, or we can sort of batch do things to all of them. We have 2 things that we can do for each of them. We can clear the line, and this is specifically talking about the term server. So if a term server line gets hung up and you're trying to get back into it and it says connection is refused because it's already active, if you don't want to just clear it out from the term server itself, you can come in here and just say clear line. Okay, it'll clear the line out from the term server, and then you should be able to connect up to that line. Revert basically just wipes the device and puts it back to a default state. So again, on a switch, it would wipe everything. You'd be back to the config of no VLANs, no interfaces, no layer 3, pristine state. So you can do that on a per device basis, or you can just say revert the entire rack and do that. So that's what that'll do. Down at the bottom, we have our servers. With the servers, we can do starts and stops. So push the power on, power off. If you ever need to power cycle a server. Or revert, again, puts it back to that sort of default state. Let's go to connect. So here's the information on how to actually connect to each of your devices, and let's talk about that in a little bit more detail here. So up on top, we have our servers. So let's talk about the 4 different servers or PCs that we have and what sort of access we have to them. So for the WCS server, it's a Windows server. So we have 2 types of access. We either have GUI access to the WCS server for our normal WCS application, or we can RDP to it if we want to just get to the underlying operating system, just like you'll have RDP access to it in the lab. So we have, here's the IP address 10.10.2.10.6. So GUI, VPN in, pull up a web GUI, go to it, otherwise RDP to it. You can see for the web GUI, we have a default user account of root with a password iPexpert123. For RDP session, it's a user account of admin and a password of iPexpert123. So 2 different ways to access WCS. ACS, again, we have 2 different ways of accessing it. We can get to just the normal web GUI, or we can SSH to it. That'd be the CLI would be an SSH connection. Here again, usernames, passwords for that, and the IP over on the right. Our Windows 7 PC, this was if you want to connect up to our wireless networks, it's our client. So we can get to it. The general steps to get to it is what you have to do is you RDP to the WCS server. Once you RDP into the WCS server on the desktop, you'll see this link for a VNC connection to the client. You just double click on that. It'll ask you for a password. Password is iPexpert123, no username, has detailed in the VNC information, and that'll get you onto the Windows 7 client. If you have to log into the client once you're actually on it, admin iPexpert123 to actually get into the OS if you're at a login screen. And lastly, the MSE, only one way to get to that one. That's the SSH connection, username root, password iPexpert123. So that's how you get to your servers. Now down below we have information to get to the console connection of all of the hardware devices. So console connections, it'll tell you what the name of your terminal server is and what port you want to telnet to. So for instance, to get to Autonomous AP1, I should telnet to wl01.proctorlabs.com, specifying a port of 2015. Now, why this non-standard port? Well, that's what tells the term server to drop you off on this console connection as opposed to a different console connection. If you just telnet to the term server on port 23, the normal telnet port, what's going to happen is you'll be on the terminal server. You won't be on one of the devices that the terminal server is connected to. And that's not what you want. You want to actually get to the console connection itself. So if I was going to use, for instance, secure CRT or whatever it's going to be, it's a telnet connection, wl01.proctorlabs.com. And this host name will change just depending on what rack you're on. So, rack 10 would be wl10.proctorlabs.com. Rack 5, wl05.proctorlabs.com. So this will change just depending on your rack assignment. But the ports are always the same. So if I wanted to get to Autonomous AP1, I'll specify port 2015. It's going to connect. Now you're going to be asked for a username. This is your proctorlabs.com account. So for me, if I can spell my name right, J678, my password. And now it says I'm on the line. Now, sometimes you get asked, I hit enter. Okay, now I can see I'm on the console for AP1. Sometimes, depending on the device, it might ask you for credentials again. Well, that's the device credentials. The first credentials you put in are always the terminal server credentials, so that's always your proctorlabs.com account. So for instance, what if I went to one of the access points? So WL01, proctorlabs.com, APs, I think 2008 will get me onto an access point here. Again, the first time we credentials, proctorlabs.com credentials. Now I'm on the console of this AP. And of course, I picked an AP that's powered off at the moment. Let me get into this one. So it asked me for a username. I have already pre-configured my a session to auto login for me. So put in proctorlabs.com account. Now it's asking me for a username again. Now this is the username of the device. So this is a Cisco AP, default credentials on a Cisco AP or Cisco. And then now I'm on LAP1. So if you ever get asked credentials multiple times, just know that the first is always proctorlabs.com. The second is the device itself. Not every device asks for credentials. Switches never do unless you specifically configure it to. So those second credentials are just device dependent. First, always proctorlabs.com. But the nice thing about telnetting to each individual port is that I can have every device open at the same time. So I could have all 15 devices in the wireless racks up next to each other, and I can be flipping around between them, no problem. That's how you're going to run into it in the lab. So in the lab, there's a term server. You don't have to do those initial login credentials. You do have to do device credentials, but not the initial proctorlabs.com credentials like we do. But you'll have separate windows for everything. Now, depending on your operating system, there's this link over to the right where you can just click on the link and it'll automatically kick off a telnet session to your terminal server on the appropriate port. I think this typically works best on Mac OS X, but not so much on Windows. But you can always try clicking on it. It might automatically bring it up for you. My recommendation is to use something like Secure CRT or something where you can automate logins and you can sort of save these for future use. And then it can auto log in for you. It's a lot nicer than having to type in your username and password over and over again. But there's some upfront effort to doing that. So I probably wouldn't do that during my session that I paid for, but maybe ahead of time or something like that. The only difficulty with that is it's kind of random which racks you get assigned to. So you sort of have to create save sessions for every rack, which I've done in Secure CRT, so might be worth doing if you want to make life a little bit easier for you. Okay, but that's connecting to all your different devices. Lastly, we have power management. So if you ever need to power cycle any of the hardware devices, this is where you're going to do it. What can we power cycle? We can power cycle all the controllers, all the switches, your terminal server. If for some reason something seems wrong with your terminal server, you can power cycle that. Your CME router, which I've never really needed to ever do, but you can. I would probably recommend that you don't need to do that. LAP2 is plugged into a power injector, so you can essentially you're power cycling the power injector there. All the other APs, all the other lightweight APs are at least using PoE off the switches, so you can power cycle the other lightweight APs just by shutting and no shutting the ports on the switches that they're connected to. We can see the servers. We can't power cycle them here. That's back over under controls, and stop and start down here is your power cycle for the servers. So usually the only reason I power cycle devices if they're hung up, they stopped responding to me and I can't just remedy it in the console. That's when you can come into the CLI, or sorry, come into here and then just power off, power on, and then you can watch the power it up through the console connections. So that is working with ProctorLabs.com. So once you sort of get the initial stuff figured out, typically if you're using these over and over again, you'll get pretty comfortable. So what you'll end up doing is you'll just do your initial lab load for whatever you want to do, get that loaded up. You probably won't be doing much under controls. I rarely do, unless you need to power cycle a server for whatever reason. You'll have all this stuff figured out already. Again, save, create sessions that you can save and reuse over and over again. Will make your life a lot easier. And then if you ever need to power cycle something, come in here. But other than, once you get used to using the racks, other than the lab load, you're actually not spending very much time in the Proctor Labs. You're just spending your time on the devices itself and doing everything you need to do on the devices. So hopefully that helps you out. But if you have any questions, don't ever hesitate to contact the support team. They're there to help you through any issues or clarification questions that you might have. So hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you next time.